Welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS and a very warm welcome to our weekly review of international events. We compiled this review with a special purpose and focus on the needs of those who are aspiring for civil service examinations. Our attempt all the time is to focus on an Indo-centric view and try to analyze how international events impact on our national interest, how the power equations are changing. And what has been happening in recent weeks is some dramatic developments in India's neighborhood have taken place. There have been tumultuous developments in Pakistan and equally significant developments in Sri Lanka, which don't bode very well for the future of these two countries. These events, whichever way they are settled, are signs of prolonged periods of instability, economic difficulties, social turmoil, and this is not likely to impact very favorably on our immediate, the first concentric circle of our relations in South Asia. We shall cover this and lot more in this discussion with you. Dramatic as the developments in Pakistan have been, perhaps it would not be very right to say that they have been entirely unexpected. The Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan has been facing political difficulties for quite a few months in the past. One major issue is that he has been totally unable to manage the economy of Pakistan well. Those who are sympathetic to him might argue that all the ills of Pakistani economy are not of his making. Trouble has been brewing up for decades and he only has been left to solve them with a magic formula which is beyond him. Things have been not very favorable to him in the immediate neighborhood. When the Americans decided to withdraw suddenly from Afghanistan, one major source of Pakistan's milking American resources that we could be most helpful to you in the Afghan war theater has been eliminated. Pakistan continues to be strategically significant for America to watch from the sidelines in Afghanistan, but at the moment the same significance is not there which was earlier there. When the Taliban took over power in Afghanistan, Pakistan gloated. They thought that they had emerged victorious in this conflict because one faction of the Taliban, the Haqqani group, was believed to be a creature of Pakistani deep state, and there was speculation that Pakistan would be able to manage them better and influence developments in Kabul. This has not happened. On the contrary, the Islamic Sultanate of Khorasan province, which has had problems with both Taliban and with Pakistan, and attacks have been mounted on Pakistan border forces in Jalalabad area. Now, if you keep this in mind, Imran Khan's position has been a bit shaky from the beginning because Imran Khan is a Pathan, he is not a Punjabi. The majority of the Pakistani army represents the Punjabis, and Punjab is a very rich, very large province of Pakistan, and it doesn't been very willing to share power, political power, either in the armed forces or if there is a civilian government or bureaucracy with people outside Punjab. So he has had to contend with this opposition of the Punjabis from the beginning. The other problem is that he cannot ever be imagined that Imran Khan won the elections because of his vast mass base. He was always been identified as the army's candidate, and he couldn't have possibly risen to this position had the army not supported him. Imran Khan, of course, has always been trying to project himself as a person who's not a puppet of the army, who resists, who pushes back army, and army has so far allowed this hybrid model to continue, thinking that this is probably the best way to manage Pakistan. Army remains behind the scene, a civilian government with the charismatic leaders in the front, and hopefully if the civilian government fails, the blame can be put on the elected representative of the people, and army is always there to step in as the savior. This is one part. But over a number of years, Imran Khan's relationship with army, if not deteriorated, they have become strained. Because what he has tried to do is that he has tried to test waters, pushing the envelope, trying to place his nominated people in the command positions of corps division and corps commanders. He also wanted to shift the ISI chief from ISI to a corps command and take his favorite person here. So army is getting a little wary that Imran Khan probably is trying to play one faction of the army against another, one ambitious general against the other. So they have come together to resist this kind of a fracturing the unity of the army, if one might say so. Now, this is not all. When we see what has been happening, is not only the economy that is the problem for Imran Khan. Imran Khan is not a people's person. He's a very popular cricketer. He's a very impressive speaker. He's Cambridge educated. He's lived abroad. He's a cosmopolitan person. He projects a very modern image. But the problem is that he has no mass contact. So his party worships him, so we believe, but the opposition parties think that he's a bit of a person who keeps aloof, who doesn't keep his own team along with him, and slowly his own supporters have been alienated from him. He listens to all, he has an appearance of a consensus building, but he decides, like the cricket captain, and goes ahead with his strategy on the battlefield. This has alienated people, and the last straws on the back of the camel have been 40 odd members of his own coalition government moved out, and he was reduced to a minority. Now, this is what the context of the no confidence motion in the Pakistan parliament is there. Now, what Imran Khan was trying to bank on was, he thought that the Pakistani laws allowed him to disenfranchise members of his own party who were defecting, and they could be disallowed to take part in the no confidence vote. But he also was pushing further and thinking that if you could also block the voting by other members of the coalition in his government, he had the battle sorted out, he would remain in power. This is difficult because all this hinges on an interpretation of constitutional electoral laws which are beyond Imran Khan's control. But the circumstances under which what happened in Pakistan is there deserves a brief review. What happened was patently unconstitutional. Eminent Pakistani journalists who are moderate, who are objective, like Najm Sethi, have analyzed it very well. They said that what happened is that Imran Khan tried to stage manage this no confidence motion. When he realized that the numbers were against him, first of all, he was of course much too haughty to negotiate with other members of opposition or his own party. He sent trusted emissaries to negotiate a deal, but when the deals failed and he was faced with the harsh reality that he didn't have the numbers, he operated through the system. What happened is that the president was favorable to him, the speaker was favorable to him, and both of them opted to stay out of the contest in the beginning, and the deputy speaker presided over the session when this no confidence motion was to be admitted. And the deputy speaker did something very unusual. He took recourse to an Article 5(1) of the Pakistani constitution, which said that at times of an emergency, all the Pakistani citizens have a duty to rally round the state. Now, in this case, the state is Pakistan. The state becomes synonymous with the government of the day, and according to Imran Khan's interpretation, the state was under threat because he claimed that there was a conspiracy, a foreign conspiracy to remove him from power. There was a threat to his life, and this became threat to the state, and it became a duty of all Pakistani citizens to rally around the state. Now, under this ruse, the deputy speaker did not even allow the no confidence motion to be introduced in the parliament. Now, interestingly, the opposition claimed, correctly constitutionally, that when on the agenda there was a single item that after X number of days of debate, 7 days of debate, the no confidence motion is tabled, no other matter can be discussed. But Speaker, of course, presiding over the House, claimed that he had the powers to decide what he could decide could not be challenged, and he refused to let the no confidence motion to be even introduced. The opposition was very angry. They went outside, they tried to get out of the parliament building, and also they went to the courts. Now, the courts in Pakistan again is a very tricky situation. Although like the British government system, like in India, there is a separation of power. There is supposedly an independent judiciary, and in past there have been cases where the judiciary, the Supreme Court of Pakistan, the Chief Justice has taken a stand against the government, whether it's Pervez Musharraf or Nawaz Sharif. It has tried to project itself as an independent institution trying to protect the constitution. But in this case, there are other wheels within wheels. What Imran Khan succeeded in doing, that he succeeded in getting nominated as an interim Prime Minister, a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and also the President resisted the challenge of the opposition to all these happenings in the court by saying that whatever happened in the House has to be decided by the House, and once the assembly has been prorogued, and of course Imran Khan recommended the dissolution of the assembly, and he said that once the assembly has been his recommendation as a Prime Minister has to be accepted, and if the assembly is dissolved and new elections have to be ordered, the newly elected assembly, whenever the elections are held, which he stipulated should take place within months, should decide the fate of Pakistan and who should be the Prime Minister or not be Prime Minister. Now, opposition, of course, is with good reason crying foul, because this only gives time to Imran Khan to manipulate, stay in power, do things which are detrimental to the opposition's interest. Can the opposition maintain its unity if there is a prolonged fight? Which way will the Supreme Court decision take place? Now, the opposition argues that the Supreme Court should have taken a decision immediately. They were only giving time to Imran Khan by listening to all parties. Supreme Court said that it was a smaller bench of 3 judges, which said a larger bench needs to hear it. A 5-judge bench was constituted. The opposition said if the matter is of such grave constitutional importance, the full bench of full 17 judges should hear this. Supreme Court, of course, turned down this plea. So there is a very interesting role which Supreme Court is playing. It seems to be asserting the independence of judiciary, trying to go into all the constitutional issues and going to sort this matter once for all. But all this time is being allowed to Imran Khan. Now, what about the Imran Khan's conspiracy theory? Now, Imran Khan says that a country, without naming America, said that this was an American conspiracy to get rid of him, and the whole point is there is not an iota of evidence which he can submit. But then, of course, if you say there is a conspiracy hatched by the secret services, intelligence agencies, no credible intelligence can ever be in public domain. There have been coups, there have been very convenient accidents, there have been convenient assassinations in past in Pakistan. Nothing has been ever sorted out. So, but then the army probably is acting very correctly at the moment, where the Army Chief BYJU'S has said that this is a matter to be sorted out between the ruling government, Imran Khan's party and Imran Khan, and the opposition parties. It is going to play a neutral role and let the civilian elected representatives fight it out amongst themselves. But even this neutrality conveys certain important signals. The army could have sorted this out either by expressing their support for Imran Khan or their opposition to it, and the rug would have been pulled from under his feet. Interestingly, Imran Khan's performance as a Prime Minister in the past few months has been very erratic. When the Russians attacked Ukraine, he ended up in visiting Moscow at that moment and made certain very tactless, undiplomatic remarks that how dramatic, how exciting the moments were. He has lost the goodwill of Saudi Arabia. He has not been able to get loans and debts and aids from his Arab Muslim friends as people thought he would. His dependence on China has increased all the time. He visited China when the Winter Olympics were there. He was one of the few international leaders to do this. So his proximity with China, his dependence on China has alienated the Americans, also has made apprehensive the Saudis and the Arab friends. His attitude towards India has been blow hot, blow cold. He never has been as friendly, as amiable as Nawaz Sharif, but nor has he been, he's been turning his stance once that India probably is not such a bad country. India's stance, because he happens to fall on the same side on India's stance, guarded Pakistan's wholehearted support to Putin. So this again has been an issue which is there. So his diplomacy has not borne any fruits. His fundraising has not borne any fruits. But we'll repeat once again, the massive billion-dollar debts which Pakistan finds itself straddled with are not of the creation of Imran Khan. Years of misrule by army, by elected representative of the people, there is hardly any public opinion which makes a difference to decision-making and policy-making, large-scale corruptions, vested interest. All this has contributed to, let's not forget that Nawaz Sharif has just been acquitted of the massive corruption charges. And when we talk in terms of alternative prime minister, we are talking not of Nawaz Sharif, maybe, but his younger brother, who's been a very efficient administrator in Punjab, the chief minister. Imran Khan's tampering with the chief ministers in Punjab has also cost him dearly, because the Sharif, the younger brother of Nawaz Sharif, has been an able administrator in Punjab. So he wanted to replace him with a person who was neither a good administrator nor a good leader. So this again has started the questioning whether he is interfering with the federal structure of Pakistan, which is going to be detrimental to Pakistan's national interest. So all these issues remain. Now it remains to be seen what the Supreme Court will decide, when the elections will take place. Will the army's patience be through and they will take a stand decisive one way or the other, or they will continue to remain in the background and let the elected representative fight it out? How long the opposition unity will be maintained? Will the time respite which has been granted to Imran Khan allow him to rally round support, rally round funds, and put pressure on opposition to break their ranks? He has told his people, come in large numbers, demonstrate that you are with me. So there might be the confrontation on the streets of Pakistan between those who support the opposition, united opposition parties, and those who support Imran Khan. But Imran Khan, as we said earlier, is worth repeating. Charismatic he was as a cricketing person, charismatic he was there when he assumed power, but he doesn't have the charisma or oratory to move masses, to move millions in Pakistan. He is no Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. He is not even Benazir Bhutto. He is not even Nawaz Sharif, who knows how to operate as a politician, as a politician who knows how to take control of his political party, how to run a coalition, how to project images of a reasonable person to India, how to be. We can't forget that he also had written a letter to the American president that how the army was trying to conspire to get rid of him. Nothing much came out of it. His relationship with the army remained strained, although at the moment army in Pakistan would like to keep all its options open. So Nawaz Sharif is no longer a pariah. His younger brother is more than acceptable. So which way the events will turn remains to be seen. And India has to be very, very alert, because whatever happens in Pakistan, the stability of Pakistan is something which is in our interest. We cannot imagine that economy can improve overnight or in a short period. The Chinese also are watching this with some interest, because they have too much at stake in Pakistan, both in the context of one belt, one road, also the massive investment which they have made in Pakistan. Would it be at risk if there is long-term instability? Remains to be seen. Sri Lanka, unfortunately, has been sliding towards a precipice on a very dangerous slippery slope for quite some time now. Again, like in Pakistan, the developments in Sri Lanka have not been unexpected. Sri Lanka has been facing an economic emergency for almost a year. The causes of this emergency have been analyzed long enough. First of all, great pressure was put on economy of the nation. It was disrupted by the decades of civil war which the Litte was responsible for. Ultimately, when the Litte's insurgency was crushed and rebuilding of the nation has started, and some progress was made, the tourism industry was revived, which is a major foreign exchange earning for the country. Suddenly, the Rajapaksa family, which is a dominant family which has been in and out of power, out for a very brief period, but in for almost 2 decades uninterruptedly, followed policies which was tilting towards China to receive massive financial assistance in lieu of what they offered to China in terms of almost extraterritorial rights on Sri Lankan territory. The port of Hambantota, which is on the east coast, which is also the pocket borough of the Rajapaksa family, was offered to China on a platter, where according to some reports they are building a naval base. Chinese have denied these reports, but the fact remains that the land has been transferred on a long-term 99-year lease to Chinese. Progress has been very tardy on the projects which China promised for the economic welfare of the people in this region. It has also been alleged that this is a deal which is crony capitalism. The Rajapaksa family has made billions, but the people of Sri Lanka have not received any benefit of this. This tilt towards China alienated Sri Lanka from a friendly relationship from India, and also it gave Sri Lanka a false sense of security that it did not need any other assistance from any other source, so it could afford to cock a snook at the International Monetary Fund or the other foreign agencies which were committed to rebuilding Sri Lanka after the civil strife was over. The other problem was that the Western countries wanted Sri Lanka to be accountable, especially the Rajapaksa family, the generals under their control, for human rights violations when the Litte was extinguished. Now, this is to our mind slightly unfair and an application of obvious double standards when the West, USA or NATO or the other multilateral agencies and the friends of the Western land systems combined to have regime change in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. Whatever violations of human rights are taking, whatever war crimes are being committed, are the soldiers of the United States of America and their allies are supposed to be immune to these charges. And whenever there is a smaller country which has eliminated the threat of terrorism, you can't fight terrorism with your hands tied behind your back, with removing your shoes, bending your head and being appeasing. So unfortunately, the war against terror cannot be fought in a civil disobedience satyagrahi mode. That is the argument of the Sri Lankan government. The Sri Lankan government has of course said that it would institute inquiries to examine into these charges of war crimes, etc. But external agencies trying to sit on judgment has also interfered with the economic development, accelerated economic development with assistance from Western agencies or international agencies in Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, there has been a gross mismanagement of the Sri Lankan economy also. We indicated that people allege that it is the Rajapaksa family enriching itself, which has resulted in distribution of resources unevenly. But the Rajapaksa government probably thought that when the economic recovery begins, tourism flourishes, nobody would ask any questions and large infrastructural development projects would ultimately be showing their benefits. The impact of COVID put paid to all these hopes. Tourism stopped, it dried up, international travel stopped, and so did stop the inflow of foreign exchange. Sri Lanka is dependent for its energy imports, food grain imports, medical imports, imports for all kinds of things, including paper and pencil for holding examination for the students. And this resulted in a situation where the Sri Lankan government had to impose an economic emergency, give charge of rationing to a general, shortages, blackouts, etc. started. There were also some knee-jerk policies. They said that if we are not being able to import chemical fertilizers which are based on petrochemicals, we would have organic agriculture. So there was a sudden switch from normal agriculture for tea and food grains to organic agriculture without adequate preparation, and that even more adversely affected the export crops of Sri Lanka like tea, etc. Now, when this was happening, the life in the cities could still be limping along, but the countryside was bearing the brunt of this. So there was this resentment against the government, which was supposed to be pro-elite and pro-one family itself, a dynastic thing. And the economic ministry was in charge of a son of a former president who has had to resign since. His younger brother, the former president, Mahinda Rajapaksa's younger brother, became the president. It became an executive presidency. When they came to power recently, the constitution was amended. More power were concentrated in the hand of the president. The president appointed his elder brother, the prime minister. So between the president, the prime minister, the finance minister, the minister for rural development, and also other members of the family were ministers. Some others, nephews, etc., were in the parliament. So it was 7-8 people of the same family occupying all the key positions. Now, this was rather distressing for there is a Sri Lankan middle class. There is a Sri Lankan media which is as yet not totally stifled. So as criticism of the Rajapaksa family was growing, more and more stern draconian measures were adopted to stifle dissent. When the economic emergency did not succeed in controlling, and people came out in protests. There were power cuts, there were examinations cancelled, hospitals said that they cannot admit patients because life-saving drugs were not there, anesthesia was not there, forget about the vaccine. So neighbors like India did help out with vaccine Maitri during COVID. But it was a very stark situation when Sri Lanka realized it did not have foreign resources enough to repay debts on bonds, sovereign bonds, or repay interest on debts it had incurred. So if it defaults in this, its rating goes down and it can't raise money on international market. It also tried to say, in the beginning with bravado, it would not ask for assistance from IMF because that would be conditionalities. Now it has had to eat the humble pie and say that it would also negotiate something with IMF. But the finance minister who was appointed to do this did not last more than a day. He resigned immediately and he said that he thinks that his presence would not have helped these negotiations. So what does the Rajapaksa family and the government do now? What they did was they imposed not only an economic emergency, they imposed a very draconian emergency which gave the president the power to impose curfew, arrest without warrant, without production before a magistrate. So this again triggered even more violent. A curfew was imposed, but people disregarded the curfew. They surrounded the presidential palace. They tried to break through the cordon. Harsh measures had been necessitated to resort to stop them. Luckily, no lives were lost, but it became very clear, and the slogans were raised, "Go, Gota, go," because Gotabaya Rajapaksa is known by his nickname Go, and they said that the country has had enough of this, please make way for the others. What the government had to do was two emergency measures. It had to withdraw the emergency ordinance. It also dismissed the cabinet, although the president and the prime minister remain in place. The president made an invitation or made an offer to opposition that the nation was going through a very bad crisis. Let there be a national government and let some members of opposition join the government and try to solve the problem together. Opposition is much too clever to fall for this temptation. They know that the Rajapaksa family is only trying to implicate them and involve them in decision making, so the failure can be shared by everybody. They can say if the government failed, it was not the Rajapaksa family, it was not the clan that failed, it was all the opposition could not do it also, so what could we have done? But they have had to withdraw the emergency. They have since made very contradictory statements. Gotabaya Rajapaksa has not said so himself, but people close to him, like Fonseca, have said, people trusted by him, president will not resign under any circumstances. And we are being reminded that the Sri Lankan, this government, Rajapaksa's party, had won with a massive majority a few years back. So they still claim that the people's mandate is with them. They have lost the majority in the parliament. People have left them. They no longer enjoy a majority in the parliament. But if they insist on digging their heels, the president and his brother, they can still remain for a few days in power and they hope to ride over the storm. But the more likely chances are that because the signs of weakness are also apparent in their armor, the chinks in their armor, so people's movement will gather momentum, and so far it is demonstrations, placards, beating of drums, shouting slogans. But if the movement is countrywide, it is difficult to imagine that this can help resolve the economic crisis at all. India has stepped in, tried to help Sri Lanka hour of its need, extended $1.5 billion US line of credit has been extended through banks, $1 billion immediate assistance has been given to tide over, and there is a swap arrangement is there. India has sent 40,000 tons of fuel immediately, 40,000 tons of food grains. So the price rise is phenomenal in Sri Lanka. 200%, 300%, 500%, milk powder, food grains, lentils, cooking oil, long lines at fuel pumps, stumps, no electricity generation. Sri Lanka not being able to unload fuel which has come to its ports because it cannot pay. So this kind of a bleak situation is not going to help by popular agitation, but at the same time, one cannot imagine how the people's anger can quell. How can the temperatures be reduced if there is this confrontationist attitude by the president? Now, it is not for an Indian, it is not for the government of India to suggest what the Sri Lankan should do, but I think if one is to think in terms of reconciliation, what is seen as the first family of Sri Lankan politics probably would have to see that what kind of a legacy they are going to leave behind. Are they going to leave behind a legacy of ruin caused by arrogance and hubris, or Are they willing to say that, look, we made mistakes, we are in offering to resolve this, we want to reconcile the nation, and maybe if they opt out, then a government of national reconciliation and national government can form, which would signal to the world that now there is a serious effort to rebuild Sri Lankan economy, and maybe then the institutions, international institutions like IMF can play the role. It is easier said than done. I think the only country which stands to gain through this turmoil is China, because China may have been the cause, but is not the only cause of economic ruin of Sri Lanka. I think it is incompetent management of the economy and corruption and hubris of a particular family who refuses to accept advice of professionals, I think has led Sri Lanka to this. Unfortunately for Sri Lanka, like for so many other countries, the impact of COVID is going to last. Tourism is not going to be revived overnight. The Sri Lankan agriculture, whether it is tea or whether it is other food stuff, cannot overnight improve. The farmers' plight is very bad. The resentment among the young is going to mount, not only because if their examinations are being cancelled because the government can't provide paper, inks, pencils, etc., it is going to be terrible. So Sri Lanka is in for very bad times in days to come. India would try to do its best to help it out, but neither India nor anybody else can bail out Sri Lanka from a crisis of making of its own leaders who still don't seem to, like the Bourbons of France, another notorious family, seem to feel that they have entitlement to rule, and they try again to point fingers at outside neighbors. But this time they can't even say that their troubles are caused by the government of India next door. There has been a charge which was being made in past against India, but I think it is time not to indulge in petty bickering. I think we are very, very sympathetic to what is happening in Sri Lanka, but Sri Lanka always is a very volatile country. It has also faced linguistic riots, it has had ethnic problems. There is close proximity with Tamils in Tamil Nadu. They also have been exposed to the Islamic terror on an Easter attack on the church. So the country is beset with a whole set of difficulties, and the economic difficulties are of the worst kind. So we wait and watch and we wish Sri Lanka well, but Sri Lanka needs more than good wishes. If we move our gaze outwards from immediate neighborhood, there are other interesting developments worth noting. And what is happening in Europe is of great interest. What is happening actually in Eastern Europe is of great interest. And this is quite natural because after Russian military intervention in Ukraine, the front line has suddenly hotted up in Eastern Europe. And the two countries which are of special significance in this matter are Poland and Hungary. Both countries have been having an interesting, strained relationship with their partners in the European Union. Both Hungary and Poland have been parts of East European satellite arrangement during the days of USSR, and even after the breakdown of USSR, although they joined NATO, they joined EU, they have been slightly estranged members of the EU family because they never have subscribed entirely to the values of the EU, which are human rights, which are democracy, which is freedom of expression, and I dare say secularism. Especially Poland and Hungary both have made it very clear. Poland more recently, Poland where Duda is there, he said that we have a church, and in our public life the Roman Catholic Church plays a very important role, and he has insisted that if the European Union insists on imposing on them the laws of Europe, they would not accept them. They consider the laws passed by their own parliament supreme. They are a sovereign nation state. Now the whole concept of European Union hinges on this, that sovereign nation states, once they become members of the European Union, accept willingly, voluntarily, the abrogation of their sovereignty to a certain extent, especially in matters of human rights, in matters of democratic values, in matters of freedom of expression, independent judiciary. That is why further cooperation becomes possible. Now once Poland and Hungary were very keen to join, like many other countries of East Europe, like Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Bulgaria, Albania, Romania, Slovakia, the Czech Republic. All were keen to get the resources to rebuild their nations from European assistance. But they were not entirely willing to subscribe to all the values. Now, Turkey, if you remember, when it wanted to become a member, it was a candidate member of the European Union, was excluded because it was argued that it did not share the values of European Union. Now, the interesting thing is this, that both Poland and Hungary have in recent years made it very clear that they are members apart from other members of Central and Western Europe. So this emphasis on Christianity, emphasis on domestic laws passed by their own parliaments. Also, both Poland and Hungary are led by leaders who can be described, whether it is Andrzej Duda or Orban, both are authoritarian. So they have been put on watch by the European Union. And actually, when they said that they would not be accepting LGBTQ friendly laws, they would continue to have a significant place for the role of church in their social life. They think that they don't value as the Western concept of freedom of expression is there, or democratic values. They don't share it. They have their own models of democracy, own models of governance. They also are significantly different in their cultural identity from, let's say, the West Europeans. They also have memories from the Second World War onward, which militate against a closer relationship with Germany. The Germany today may be very different from the Nazi Germany, but the memories among the older generations of German occupation continue. Now, if we keep all this in mind, very recently the European Union has imposed monetary fines on both these countries, that unless they accept this, unless they accept European values, they cannot accept millions of dollars of funds, millions of euros of funds, billions of dollars of European funds to come to them. Ursula von der Leyen had made this very clear. This has been very interestingly affected by the events in Ukraine. Now, because both Poland and Hungary are bang on the front line, and also Orban has been re-elected, Andrzej Duda has been re-elected, and they have shown that the majority of their people support them. Now, this is very incongruous, this is very ironical. There was at one time that, of course, one can argue that the elections were fixed and so on, but the real fact is that in both countries, there is a great divide between the younger and the older generation, the urban versus rural population, and the memories linger on of a socialist past which are not quite in conformity, in synchrony with how the rest of the Europe thinks. One could even argue that there is a worldwide rise of authoritarian leaders who are popular, who seem to project an image of a messiah to their people, who retain their support, who are charismatic, who are demagogic. That apart. What has happened recently is more interesting. The European Union has been forced to go back on its fines. It has said that, all right, keeping in mind the needs of Poland and Hungary, their difficulties should not be exaggerated. They are welcoming refugees from Ukraine with open hand. Poland has a very large burden of refugees from Ukraine, relationship of kith and kin, some Jewry, and then they say these fines have been waived off. They are getting back their money. Now, this leads to a very interesting question about the future of the European Union. If Poland and Hungary are allowed to get away by challenging the core values of the European Union, democracy, freedom of expression, shared values about judiciary, and insist on their domestic laws reigning supreme over European laws, what remains of the idea or the values of European Union? Why should the other states, to begin with the East European countries, and still later the others, not insist on the same thing? So this is a critical existential dilemma for the European Union at the moment. There are other things happening in Eastern Europe which are of concern to European Union. Slovakia has said that it depends on 85+% of for its fuels coming from Russia, so it cannot afford to boycott Russia and follow the SWIFT directives. It has already shown its willingness that it will deal with rubles to get the oil and gas from Russia. Now, this is also the beginning of the thin end of the stick getting into the door. would other countries follow? If Slovakia does it today, what do we expect Czechoslovakia to do? What do we expect? I mean, at the moment, the small countries, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, are putting up a brave front. But when they are confronted with a pincer from Russia and Belarus, and when the Ukraine crisis takes a turn, hopefully not for the worse, how long can they resist the pressure from the Russians on energy needs? Because their natural linkages are with Russia from the days of USSR. So I think the European Union is faced with a very real challenge about its integrity, about its core values, and it's making compromises on vital issues which may lead ultimately to its unraveling. While this is happening, French are focused on the election or re-election of President Macron. So I think we would do well to shift attention from time to time from France and Germany to the eastern part of the European Union, eastern and central part of Europe, and see how they affect our interests. Because India again might be facing a challenge of redefining its relationship of oil energy imports, military imports from Russia, and think in terms of rupee-ruble trade and things of this kind. India is again forced to walk a very tight rope. It has, without naming Russia, criticized what has happened in Bucha in Ukraine. It has taken a stance for, as the External Affairs Minister said, for peace and justice and equity. But all this is noble sentiments. Ultimately, you have to take a decision and follow it. And we seem to be having a coincidence of interest in our national interests and the East Europeans at the moment. But obviously, we cannot support the support of Christianity, opposition of LGBTQ rights, freedom of expression. We don't have a totality of overlap of interests. But as far as the energy security is concerned, as far as defense security is concerned, military hardware purchases, there seems to be a situation in a flux, and we'll have to think about it very carefully as days pass. That is all we have for you this time. But before we conclude, we would like to remind you that what has happened is a very interesting situation. For the first time after a long number of years, situations are coming to a boil both in our immediate neighborhood, in the next concentric circle, and also in theaters where relationship with European nations of India matter very much, and our relationship with Europe has been conditioned by responding to European Union as a whole, and also major actors like France and Germany. We normally, since the breakup of the Soviet Union, have not looked at Eastern Europe with the same degree of interest as we did during that period of towards the last days of non-alignment and breakdown of Soviet Union. Right now, the events in Ukraine have led to a situation where there seems to be a deep divide in European Union. And this deep divide is not something temporary. It had been transparent. Opposition to secular policies in Poland and Hungary, opposition to the idea of democracy as preached by the Western nations, strong pushback against the right to treat equally the LGBT community, to have insistence that the domestic laws of these countries should be given primacy over the European laws. And also, when you talk of these things, what were the disputes? The disputes were about human rights, about freedom of expression, about freedom and independence of judiciary. Now, if all this is in opposition to what the European Union believes in essentially, and the fines imposed on Poland and Hungary are retracted, it seems that a slow retreat from core values and the mechanisms which have been set to discipline these countries, ultimately the strategic interests of the West seem to be dominating over the project of European Union, which wanted to build a structure of stable peace, a supranational organization with membership diverse but shared core values which would avoid conflict in future. This may temporarily resolve the crisis, but please think about it, what it means for the future of Europe. And as we focus on this, let us also not forget what is happening in the immediate neighborhood. What do we give a primacy to? What is happening in Pakistan? What is happening in Sri Lanka? Or both are equally important for us? One step removed How does it affect our relationship with China? Think about this. Try to analyze on your own. Be rational, dispassionate, and reach conclusions of your own. Till we meet again, thank you and goodbye.